All right, welcome, folks. We have 6 of us on today's call. Fantastic. Today, we're talking about meritocracy. Let's try and define that. I want to maybe avoid some of the political controversies around how do we bring a diversity of people. But I guess that's an interesting part of the conversation. What does it mean to have meritocracy at the same time as diversity? And where do we find the right balance? Or I guess organizations will do things differently. As we talk about quite a bit in Hypha, it's very interesting to me that we want performance in the sense that our organization has a purpose. We want to achieve the purpose. And we do that by working together to decide on the priorities. That's why we have roles. We assign people or we agree that people will fulfill a certain thing based on some type of meritocracy, based on them, our confidence that they can help us achieve goals. And so there's an element, at least, of performance, of getting things done. And then on the other side, we remind ourselves about relationship and the tensions that can happen if we're pushing too hard on different things. So there's that whole other area as well. A few opening reflections. Hopefully it helps to spur the conversation. Joachim, you got your hand up. Let's go over to you first of all.
Great. Thank you, Gabriel. Let's set the stage a little bit about meritocracy, right? I mean, fundamentally, this is the belief that those who are the most capable or the most hardworking people rise to the top of an organization, right? They're the ones who earn most of the rewards. That's sort of the encapsulation of how organizations understand meritocracy, right? So we look at the individuals, we look at their abilities, their achievements, we look at their resumes, we look at the work they did in the past, right? We don't look at sort of where they come from, right? Class, wealth, background, any other social economic factors here. We try to sort of focus on sort of the abilities, the most objective ways to look at someone to say you're qualified, right? You are the one who can advance in the organization. That's the traditional picture. And if you look at organizations today, typically this is handled through an HR department, right? Human resources, seeing humans as a resource. It's someone you can find out there. And by looking through, vetting through typically hundreds of applications. That's what organizations deal with today. They look at CVs, they look at resumes, they looked at LinkedIn profiles, they looked at all of the stuff that's quote unquote the objective material that's out there. But of course, traditional organizations don't stop there. They say, okay, we know there's some untruths, in these resumes. We can't really believe what they say on paper there. We need to invite them in. So the next step to confirm that these abilities really exist and they're hiring a quote unquote hardworking new employee is to go through interviews. So the classic step is to go through 10, 20, 30 interviews. Is not unheard of in an organization. So they want to know. So they send it to all of the departments, all of the future bosses that might be involved in the hiring process to find out, right? To find out. So that's the traditional picture. And let me stop here, Gabriel, because before we dive into what the DAO can do to actually change that picture or see it in a new and fresh perspective, I want to stop here for setting the stage of what meritocracy is today.
Yeah, perfect. I got something to share as well that I picked up on a website. It was their perspective on what meritocracy means. And I found it really interesting. Before I share that, let's get any other opening comments on what does meritocracy mean to any of you guys? Do you want to share some initial reflections before we get into solutions? Just what comes up for you when we think of meritocracy? Alexandra, you were first.
It's a big term because I think abilities sometimes they can come to passion of loving an environment and loving something deeply. And when you work through passion, you can probably accomplish a lot of things, even though you can have PhDs or masters or university attached to your CVs, that's another way of definitely being passionate about something. But to me personally, it consists more of the passion of individuals to create a new endeavor for themselves. Yeah.
Let me add on here. So Gabrielle, you had said during the introduction, the whole concept is inside this container called an organization desiring to achieve something. So an organization is desiring to achieve something, and if that is defined really narrowly, my goal is to make 100 widgets this week, then you would, of course, want whoever is the most skilled at making 100 widgets in a week. If, however, your organization is more broad, its purpose is more holistic and more integrated, then it's not always so clear when I think of meritocracy and applying that to a more broad, purposeful organization. How can I really say, yes, I'm going to hire a person to perform this role, this task on behalf of the purpose of the organization? It's not so clear how you evaluate merit per se among all of the people that can perform the task, because people bring so many soft human skills that increase the joy and the team culture and effectiveness of the organization. So meritocracy is a difficult thing, and it requires a decision. So the governance is tightly woven into the word meritocracy. How is the decision made?
Amazing reflections there. It definitely highlights the challenge of not just defining it, but the use case for meritocracy in different types of organization. It's very interesting. Arsene, over to you.
Yeah, when I first heard the word in Hypha context, I did not connected it to that. So I have kind of had negative connotation of it. And it reminds me of this, like I'm always trying to remind myself that like always to kind of correct the terms, what they mean kind of in the old organizational world and what they mean now. So for me, that was the first tricky part. When I heard it, it sounded like it's like old world organization is sneaking into DAOs. But I think it's important and it's amazing that we have kind of women on this call. So it brings different perspective, especially because what it's interesting because first thing that Alexandra said is kind of like, yeah, it's about passion, right? It's not about performance, it's about passion. So I really think that we need either to find new words or to kind of work on redefining definition. So for me, at first, it's just that word kind of reminds you of kind of negative connotations. And the second thing is that I believe it requires a lot of maturity among people in order to understand this word properly. Because if not, I think it can be again abused and be like, okay, it can be used to kind of against each other. So it's very kind of tricky term. And I think it requires very big level of maturity. It reminds me of this quote that I read somewhere, that if we humans now get kind of free energy that is possible, it's like giving kids machine guns. So it's kind of similar in DAO world and meritocracy. I think it's like introducing it very fast to DAO world. It can be very dangerous because it can turn things around to the old way of being.
Yeah, well, speaking of giving kids guns, what about Gen Z that's coming into the workforce now? I think, what was the statistic? It's going to account for over a quarter of the workforce in the next couple of years. And these are people who outright explicitly do not want to be managed. So the world of work is having to make this shift, this transition. How do we account for this diversity of interests at the same time as protecting or serving the best interests of the organization as a whole? Again, very challenging. I'd like to share my screen. I'm going to share this little, just the top of this page. It's a fair bit to read. I won't bore the audience with that, but just these first two paragraphs. So if you can't see this, please let me know. A meritocracy refers to a workplace without hierarchy. So we're all about not having hierarchy. So that was a good start to the sentence. I'm there. Essentially, everyone has the right to speak and the right to be heard. Okay, still on the same page here. Good stuff, sociocratic principles, everyone has a voice. On this basis, employees who work hard and achieve results should progress based on their performance. So I don't know if there's a logical disconnect there, but I'm okay with that. That sounds good to me. That generally goes along with my thinking of meritocracy. You have merit. So let's go to the second paragraph. A relatively new concept, meritocratic workplace does away with the idea that those who have served an organization the longest or simply have the most years of experience should work in higher ranking roles. I'm in agreement here as well. As I've grown up in my career, there's certainly been times where I've looked at more senior people and think they're not up to date with the times. They don't know the latest technology or whatever it is. And so but they hold positions of power, and there's been a tension there. So this is again the idea of reducing that hierarchical structure, because I think maybe to Mark's point, there's that diversity of ideas. You don't know what is the most meritocratic person to have in a role if the scope of the organization is actually quite broad. How do you judge who is the most meritocratic person to have? Hence, we want that diversity of voice, reducing the hierarchy to a flat hierarchy. I'll just continue to finish here. In a meritocratic organization, employees are rewarded based on their achievements and nothing else, disregarding age, gender, and any other discriminatory factors. So I thought that was very good, because it suggests that you should be limited or judged based on your merit or the contribution, not your skin color, your gender, your background, your how many degrees you've got, but it's actually the contribution that you can actually make. So just for me, a very interesting blend of ideas there. Alexandra, over to you.
Yes, this part, it really struck with me. It's just given a lot of people that usually work the hardest in an organization, sometimes they're not really highlighted somehow. And that's the beauty of the DAO. Because of the transparency, people can really see their achievements and what is going on up playing field. And perhaps it's something the word needs to be addressed in a different, it needs to be elevated or upgraded, like Arsenic mentioned. But yeah, I agree with all the stuff about not looking at any hierarchy and not looking at an individual as, any background, but just the merit and the achievements that they bring to the organization.
Okay, so we got this kind of foundation. We got the achievements that they bring, the contributions that people bring to the organization. We also understand, I think we got the consensus here that we need to have very wide open diversity, have people be able to give their opinions. From my previous experience as head of marketing, I never really believed that the best marketing ideas were going to come from myself just because I had that job title. The truth is that very often it comes from anyone in the organization, whether they're in the marketing department or any other department. Insights can come from anywhere, and it should. And then my job was to help to curate those insights and help the team make better informed decisions.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriel. Thank you for the definition, which I find very interesting. Let's try to dissect that a little bit. Again, even before we talk about what this might look like inside a DAO, right? So the text said, those who work the longest, right, or have served really the longest in an organization, they have shown sort of their capabilities, and they should have the most to say, right? They're the most senior people in the organization. Well, yes, but what happens is, in order to build on this and actually make it real, let's say that way, you need to climb through some kind of a career path, right? That means you start with sort of a low-level entry, low-level skills, or maybe you'll come from some university and you still have an entry-level position in the organization, right? So you start at the bottom of the organization and you climb higher, right? You earn the trust. You earn what you said you've been doing, by running projects, by participating in some activities in the organization, but you climb up. That climbing up is through what? Well, it's through a kind of hierarchy, right? Because you go through the junior position to the senior position to the partner position, right? To the very top of the organization. There's this sort of pull, to say, I'm entering this organization with a low level of skills because I don't know anything about what they do and how they work. But over time, I understand that, right? But I only can advance to this career path, which is an organizational hierarchy, right? Which is actually then tied to some kind of way to evaluate the employee, right? And this is done obviously through performance management, right? So there are tools out there, and they vary to different degrees. We know a lot about the tools that they use. Many of us have experienced and suffered through these kind of 360-degree interviews or stack ranking, whatever's out there. But it is sort of an evaluation tool, right? To say, so you're going up the hierarchy now. You've proven your worth. Now let's go to the next level of the hierarchy. Interestingly, I want to bring up two other examples here. In a traditional, Japanese organization, you're essentially hired for life, right? So you offer your lifetime work for a single organization, right? Tied to a family relationship, tied to you're brought into the organization because you stay there forever. That's the idea. You never leave them again, right? So even in that context where there's the belief of, yes, you are the right person, you have the right skill sets, but you end up in a hierarchy in that context. Same is true for an educational context. Take a classic, university, right? You might think that's the quintessence of meritocracy, right? I mean, there can't be any other place than this, where it's really looking at your skills, what you've learned and how you advance there. But you look behind the scenes of any organization, right? Any university, and there's a hierarchy. There's a big hierarchy. There's a big bureaucracy. There's ways to kick people in and out of the organization, of the educational context there. And it looks not nice, right? It's not what we think it is. So there are many examples, I think, where, yes, meritocracy is at the foundation. That's what we think is at the heart of this. But if you look behind the scenes, you look behind the curtain, there's other dynamics happening in these different contexts.
Japan, tragically, I've picked up on this. I'm not sure how accurate it was, but I certainly remember seeing that there are more suicides in Japan, tragically, because people feel stuck in the same job, and they're culturally, they're not supposed to change even their job, and they won't quit because of whatever the culture is. And it's quite very tragic if that's the case.
First is the way I understood today's conversation is, okay, we are moving from kind of traditional hierarchy to something that is supposed to be more equal, right? So in a sense, there is invisible hierarchy. There is always some form of kind of hierarchy. For me, problem, and I think we all bring different perspective, and I think I bring perspective to this, what can happen when you are kind of in an environment where things such as this work against you. So that's why I'm very cautious about these things. That's one part. Another part is sometimes I feel the danger of this approach is focusing on the performance only rather than potential, can kind of put focus on wrong things. So instead of kind of having members who will grow and develop, it can be all about performance. And then these members can kind of suffocate in that and again end up in fear, where it's like constantly, oh, how am I performing? So in the way I see this is maybe influenced by what I'm currently reading, which is the book about the archetypes, king, warrior, magician, lover. And this really reminds me of that people who are longer in organization, because the way that's the part when I started getting itchy. It's like the people who are longest are kind of have the most influence, right? And then that's kind of the part for me that is a little bit problematic. But how I see that and how I'm kind of looking at as Hypha, maybe I'm delusional, but I'm seeing Hypha from start like that like people like Joachim and Mark are not like traditional organization, like bosses in the world, but more like wise elders, right? Whose role is not to kind of, their role is to guide and to recognize certain things, but it's much different than kind of being, okay, I'm longest here, so I'm going to, in a sense, be at the top of the hierarchy, but rather their goal is more advanced, more mature. That's why I think in this conversation, we really need to bring level of maturity, because in the book, there is this comparison, who read it, between kind of boy boy archetype and man archetype, and explaining how basically we are living in this crisis, that most people are kind of stuck in this boy archetype, and that kind of whole current kind of 20th century corporation model reminds me of that. And that's why I think we really need to bring this to the conversation in order to understand what really this means. Because also, if you mention Gen Zs, and I don't think, like, I'm not Gen Z technically, but I think I can understand them. And that's the part that I think is how actually, what is the role of the older people? Because I think what we are working in towards, in my case, is much closer to some models that were maybe closer to indigenous people rather than before. That's why I'm bringing kind of this role of wise elder that I don't fully understand. I'm just kind of researching and trying to understand. But my understanding before, when I would read about that, I would always think that wise elder is kind of like boss of the, but it's actually not. And then I think that's very interesting point for this conversation, because for me, these people that are longest, they have the most responsibility to kind of bring forward these people who are the least amount of time there. So
it's true, isn't it, that each generation doesn't really want to listen or do what their parents did. When there's always that is baked into humanity, is really each generation wants to do their own thing, and that means there's going to be change. I just want to clarify to be sure that I read this correct. It said a meritocratic workplace does away with the idea that those who have served an organization the longest or simply have the most years of experience should work in higher ranking roles. So it's the idea that even if you've been there a long time, doesn't mean that you have the merit to have the senior position.
Yeah, there's lots of great ideas in there, Arseny and Gabrielle. And when I was listening to the original 2 paragraphs that you read, it seemed to me that the thing that was coming up the most for me was that this tension of the boundary. You know, if you are creating a company where everybody is, working the cash register at Walmart, or they're the barista at Starbucks, and because there's some kind of performance meritocracy kind of process going on, somebody can't make enough coffees per minute, And so because they didn't make the threshold, then they get fired. They're no longer there. And the company is seeing its relationship to the community, its relationship to the people, that their team, as limited by this meritocracy process. And if someone falls out there, then you send them out to the outside world, where society picks up the responsibility, or communities or cultures, or whatever, because it's no longer the responsibility of this organization. And when you compartmentalize organizations into small little buckets like this, then they don't really have responsibility to culture, or to the commons, or to the larger picture. And that was the tension that I was hearing in that meritocracy. You can't play football anymore, so get out of here. And then what does the person do? They have to find a new place, and maybe society has to then help them out. I also think about the companies that are driving some kind of outcome that meets but they create these external problems for society. And so meritocracy, that was what was coming up for me as you read those paragraphs, is the responsibility for the organization in the community.
Yeah, it's just quickly, the thing of athletes, like the Olympics, you either win the gold medal or you don't. If you're not in the top 10, then you're not in the lineup for the race. And then the generation that gets too old to be a top athlete, what do? They go and become an athletic coach, or they teach in a school, or there needs to, society as a whole has to be able to account for that diversity and the changes that happen. So when we talk about meritocracy, we're talking about individual organizations, but we've at the same time got this wider ecosystem. We've got a civilization. We want it to be civilized, and to create, I think is what I'm picking up, is to create those opportunities that people can transition and move comfortably and be supported into other things if they can no longer do something that they were previously doing, perhaps. Alexandra, over to you.
Yeah, they bring a great subject, and I love what Arseny mentioned about the child archetype and man archetype, you know, it's important because if you're in a child archetype, you need to have a hierarchy. It's maturation. That means you need to be told what to do. And if you come with that framework, then of course you're always going to wait for somebody to tell you what to do. So you need to have some sort of maturity to be able to create action with the way you either create a role or escalate in your progress, right? In an organization. So when you mention about an athlete and yeah, they kick them out because they're not performing, a lot of these athletes that have been kicked out for either injuries or any other, you know, abilities that they're not performing, they're usually wounded by trauma. They're like, oh, I had to do this job of being an assistant because I got injured, I got kicked out. And that ability of being able to help and hold the community member and help them progress to a new role or a new way of perhaps seeing themselves that they haven't seen before is extremely important. I saw it and see it a lot with a lot of members were not in the right environment. They were struggling. They were being, you know, not only overwhelmed by everybody's thoughts and opinion. And once they realized that, they were able to move to the right place. And that's something that we need to hold space for the members in our, yeah, in our communities and organizations.
Absolutely. A chairman I once reported to, he actually put it to me that I gave our fellow head of sales enough rope to hang himself because the head of sales made a mistake because we gave him free rein to do his own thing. And he made a significant mistake, a certain oversight. What I've tried to do in a lot of management is kind of an apprenticeship role where I give a certain amount of guidance until to the extent that they need or want it. So they would come to me. It's kind of an insurance policy. The idea is do what you want, but let me have visibility of those decisions that you're making so that we can at least have a conversation about it if I see some risk. And then the experiment should be driven by you. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't seem to want the initiative or don't take the initiative to think of their own experiment or their own approach. So some people want to be told what to do and they feel more comfortable by having someone telling them what to do. Management is it's a very, very tricky thing. Let's get some reflections from Arseny. I feel like maybe Joachim can help take us into how the ideas of how a DAO does meritocracy and that balance, and so we can progress the conversation. First of all, over to Arseny.
Yeah, I think it's good that we bring ecosystem. And I think we really, when we talk about, we cannot no longer speak about organization in silos. And I think that's kind of underlying theme that will come over and over again. And I think it will take us used to, for our generations that are on the call, probably for future generation, it will be funny what we were talking here. But for our generation, it will get used to realize that like we are not organization working in silo in our mission and nothing else matters. So we are slowly waking up to this, that everything is connected, right? So this idea I really like, and kind of to highlight that this idea of meritocracy cannot work to its full potential if there is no space to grow for people who kind of pass on to a certain level. Because currently, if you think about tech world, everything is optimized for 20 somethings, right? It's like technically when you are 35, you are gone. Like you're basically considered senior and like you cannot achieve the same. So I think there needs to be this level of transitions. And one of the things, we mentioned in sports, I think sports has this positive and negative side, which is like theater, right? It helps us kind of distract ourselves and process certain things through that. But I think, for example, I know that my uncle was working on the airplanes, right? And I think that's maybe more relevant because airplanes, like everybody wants to travel safety. So the engineer that's doing the check, you really want somebody who has full concentration. But when he kind of enters certain age, he was fully accepted into academy of that airplane company, and then he was basically doing his best. So I really feel like there needs to be this space, and I think the tension that was coming before is that basically senior manager were trying to put down people from the bottom and kind of still keep their position and use their position of the advantage rather than finding space for both, right? Rather than, it also reminds me of one startup that I saw that was super interesting, which was kind of elders from the US who kind of maybe have children but don't have constant contact with their children, and then kids around the world kind of connecting, and then they are teaching them English. So it's kind of this where you connect best of both worlds rather than say, okay, you're old, you're now gone. And I think this kind of limit for being old is getting lower and lower. We will now get like, oh, you're 10 years old, now you're old too, right? So it's like getting to the point of craziness. So I think it's really important of kind of what's happening around. And I think we usually talk here about this. And at one of the previous conversation, we open discussion of the ecosystem, but just want to bring this back, how it's relevant and how we need constantly to kind of look things around and kind of how things are connected. Yeah, we are here and we are focused on our organization, but how we are connected with others.
Okay, good stuff. Over to you, Joachim.
Yeah, thank you, Arseny. Yeah, I love that example of how there can be pockets in organizations where it actually works, right? You mentioned, I think, kind of maintenance crews at the airport, or to build airplanes. They stick together. They know what they do, and they have a significant level of trust. So these crews, these groups, they do work, right? And they extend, to other pockets in the organization. And I think that makes them tick, and that makes them really move into a better space for the employees. So I want to move a bit deeper into DAOs now. We've seen that sort of meritocracy is kind of a hollow concept for traditional organizations. There are attempts, obviously. I mentioned these pockets and these crews. But overall, when they talk about, we're not looking at, seniority, we're not looking at certain other criteria here. We're open to everyone. Everybody can advance in our organization. We know that's not true, and we want to look at something else, right? So what we're building now with Hypha is a DAO, right? A DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization. It's a new kind of organization. It's not just a new kind in the sense of, oh, then that's a teal organization. Oh, then that's just a holocratic organization or sociocratic organization. One of these new types, they've been around for a long time already, right? If they would have been this concept, then everybody would have already converted into this new type of organization, right? And there are many attempts, obviously, of large organizations who really wanted to try what a holacracy looks like, right? And then many of them failed because a lot of the foundational pieces are not in place. What we're trying to do is to think hard about these foundational pieces. What needs to be in place in order to create an organization that can at least, follow some of these principles that meritocracy sets out to do. So let me start with some of the things that we've built at Hypha. One thing that we're doing is to lower the barriers to entry. It's this idea of an onboarding process that is almost seamless, almost like a 3-click thing, and you're inside that new thing called organization. And for us, it's important to see an organization not as a company, with hard boundaries where you have to go through an HR department, you have to go through 20 interviews before you're in, right? We invite people purposefully into the organization. And that's true for Hypha, but I see this also reflected in the many other alphas that we have running, over 100 organizations that also are able to lower the barriers of entry. So they can now invite people into the organization and get to know them, not because of the expertise and their resumes that they put out there on the internet, but more so, and I think that's what Alexandra mentioned earlier, is their passion, it's their drive. It's the reason why they really wanted to join an organization like yours. because they've seen something that wasn't present in traditional organizations. So it's this ability to build a different kind of work culture. And you sense it when you come into the organization. I've heard this many times. People are joining Hypha. They sense, oh, this is different. This, you can't really compare this new space with something like a traditional thing, where you go through your procedural steps, right? You get your desk. It used to be a calculator. Now you have your laptop, right? And then off you go, right? It's different, right? So for me, it is a different organizational design. That's a little bit of my background, comes from organizational design. And a friend of mine, Jerry Mikulski, coined the term design from trust. Is it even possible to say we design an organization that's built on trust, not on sort of mistrust that we typically see in organizations, which means you have to confirm, you have to prove all the time who you are, right, in order to advance in your career. And that leads me to the last point I wanted to make to transition into the DAO conversation. DAO is designed with what I call biomimicry, at the heart. Biomimicry is a design concept that says we can borrow a lot of concepts from nature, right? Including things like a hierarchy. So a hierarchy is a thing that exists in nature. It's different than the power hierarchies we see in traditional organizations, right? With these org charts and boxes stacked on top of each other, right? A natural hierarchy exists in nature. It exists everywhere. And what we're trying to do is to say there's also this concept of a hierarchy inside a DAO, right? But it's a decentralized way of building this hierarchy. And we're using a holonic concept for that, which is kind of nested circles. And we can get into the mechanics, maybe after this, to see what actually are these foundational building blocks. What's really different from a traditional organization? So one thing is hierarchy, right? So a natural hierarchy. The other thing, and I was glad to hear Arsenia, you brought this up, which is maturity. There's this idea of a natural maturity that you bring into the organization, right? A transformation that needs to happen, right? To get to that thing, what we think is better, the better work environment, maybe the future work environment, but something that's built on trust and invites people to really come through with their passion, with their drive, right? And why they really wanted to join a thing like this. And that means there's a transformation happening, a transformation for individuals who have to go on their own journey to discover what it really feels like, what it is like to work in an organization like this. But then you get to the next stage, which is, it's the organizational transformation. So if you think personal transformation is hard, well, organizational transformation is even harder, right? It's the, cumulative effect of all the people coming together and building this thing, right? How can we even transform this? And then if you think organizational transformation is hard, think about societal transformation. What about if you bring that to the next level and say, what happens if there are 1,000 DAOs out there? They're starting to coordinate, and collaborate and exchange these ideas and build solutions around that. That's almost impossible. I mean, that's a task we set out to do, to say, yes, we'll attempt that. We think the DAO is the right container to do this, and we'll see where that takes us next.
Alexandra.
Yeah. I've been hearing three words that are like, passion, maturity, trust. And a lot of these concepts are in our constitution for Hypha. So it's great to take a look at that document as well. I do believe it's a transformational, not only individually as a person, as a human, but also as a collective, right? And recently I was just observing a ton of ants. I mean, the walking ants that have bougainvillea flowers and green leaves carrying around everything. And you see some ants carry a bigger load than others, right? And you could say, wow, that ant is carrying a huge load, that they were all trying to get into this tiny little entrance. And the coordination was insane. It was so chaotic. But at the same time, you knew there was an order to it. So I feel that's how a lot of us that are working in DAOs, we're all individually carrying some sort of workload, anything, responsibility roles. And then we all merge into the collective mission of being there for everyone, and creating some sort of work. So it just reminded me of that, how we have to not only mimicry, but also nature. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it reminded me this what you said of kind of what we discussed in some of the previous episodes. And it is really this what Joachim says, that before it was like really like fear-based approach, right? You're considered guilty and you need to prove that you have capabilities. Basically, you are going through this whole process. I was not thinking about that. But when you're hired in traditional organization, you are literally considered liar. And then you need to prove yourself through so many trials, right? And then finally, maybe you got accepted. But I feel like one of the things that I notice, which is very magical part of working, is when you kind of move from this. And I think I have feeling that probably some of us in certain situation, how much deep we will be, we will kind of go back and be like, oh, do I need to control something right now? But when you let go that control, I just feel like this thing with ants, like things kind of fluidly arrange themselves. Maybe at this moment, like other developer can take bigger load, but then I will do something that will kind of contribute. And then just kind of recognizing also this thing that you were mentioning before, Alexandra, kind of this diversity of perspective. And I think that's related to meritocracy, but what we are measuring for. It's like you read this definition that we are kind of measuring this performance. And that can be considered, are you measuring how many miles you run, or are you actually measuring how much you enjoy when you run 10K, right? So you can say, okay, maybe I can run the most, but Alexandra can, when she runs 10K, she enjoys the most. So what are you going to actually measure for? So I think that's also important part of that. And also to kind of conclude what Joachim said, I see that there was this progression between traditional organization, and then we have this period of holacracy, teal organization, which are kind of software. And then DAO, I think, bring necessary hardware for this software, right? Because before you were kind of running on very old hardware, all of this new operating system, and that was kind of working, but not fully. So I feel DAO and this new organization paradigm really bring the power on the level of kind of operating system. But then other part, which is really important, and I think we need to highlight on each of our kind of calls, is that it also requires level of maturity. And I think this level of maturity needs to work through the collective. And I think the biggest job that the DAO will have is kind of figuring out how they kind of move from this old to the new and how they support each other. Because probably like early adopters of this kind of went through this process and came to a certain point. But then the question is how you bring others to the same kind of level.
Mark?
Yeah, I wanted to say that it really is about a community. A DAO as different than a company, and the community are humans, and they care for each other. They care about being joyful and accomplishing things that they're proud of. And they also are observing where their community fits into nature, into the world where we find ourselves. And I think that's really what the DAO and where meritocracy is about. It's like, what are you measuring? You know, are you measuring the ability to perform this task, or are you really appreciative about the person performing that task also dances and clean, and helps the water be more beautiful outside? It's a whole thing, and it's hard to measure it all. And so there's a certain kind of kindness that is necessary. There's a certain kind of appreciation that's necessary, and grace to really be in this space where you're wanting meritocracy to be even and appreciate the most skill, but it's not so black and white as to what you're measuring. That's the part.
Beautiful reflections there. Start to give some closing comments. Back to the ants, Alexandra, I too spend my time watching ants, and it's pretty fascinating.
And bees in the beehives too.
Bees, I got stories to tell. Seriously, these guys walk around. One thing to notice is that ants, when they're migrating, when they're walking in a long line, when they're carrying the stuff, they bump into each other, right? And you start off by thinking, can't these guys walk straight? Why do they keep bumping into each other? And you realize that it's the way it's a form of communication. It's a form of being in touch with each other and having a sense of which direction as a whole they're going in. So that frequency of communication, I think, is a good analogy for what creates that kind of the blend of whatever it is that we're talking about. That mix of meritocracy based on passion and capacity, how much they can carry and what they're whatever. It's like that constant communication. I think that's important as well in the way that we think of as a decentralized autonomous organization. It's not that we're all doing our own thing separately. We have to be bumping into each other and having that connection to kind of stay on the same page one way or another. I also just, my last closing comment, hand over to Joachim, is this idea I found very interesting that a DAO doesn't need to be seen as a company with a very specific goal to achieve, like Mark introduced right at the beginning of the call. But it can be a group of passionate, interested people that don't even necessarily know what their final outcome is necessarily. It might be values based, and they might be getting together and saying, hey, we're going to explore this together. We're going to figure out where we want to go, how we're going to do it, how we find balance with each other, develop it from that root of relationship. That makes a lot of sense to me as well. So I think there's no one cookie cutter approach that we have to agree on. I think some organizations that can act as decentralized organizations, they can be very, very specifically, narrowly purpose driven, and they know what they have to do to get there. And there will be that type of a meritocracy within that organization. At the same time, there can be other types as well. Those are my closing thoughts. Over to Joachim. Maybe Joachim, you want to leave us with a teaser for next conversation, perhaps, because we started to open up another can of worms. So let's keep people in suspense with what's to come in next week's call. Over to you, Joachim, and then maybe
Sure.
finals from Arsene.
Sure. Thank you. That's fantastic. I mean, bumping into each other is a form of communication. That's going to be my quote of the month. I mean, this is really cool. Okay. So let me pick up both of what Mark said and about DAOs are really communities, right? And that's actually been the first definition of a DAO, which says it's a large community with the treasury, right? And then they make some kind of decisions what to do with the money that's coming in, right? And that's what a DAO was built for. That's for me the first generation of DAOs. What we're doing now is to look at this thing, looking at sort of really that anthill, right? The millions of ants there that at first glance appear to be chaotic, right? There's a massive movement and I don't know what's going on. There's no structure at all, right? That's the first glance. But I think over the years, as we build the Hypha DAO, we recognize there is structure, right? There are certain elements inside that anthill that provides the right structure, that provides the right signaling to ants, to say, hey, go this way, not that way. Hey, the food is over there. Look, the queen is right here, got to support her. So there is structure in place. And I think we've now uncovered over the years to say, what are these structural elements, right? What makes it go to the next stage of, yes, it can be a chaotic community. And we all have come, I think, from communities where we've really found the passionate people that we wanted to meet, the passionate topics that were out there, right? Have really deeply engaged and have benefited from the idea of what a community space is. But we also had a hard time to actually get into action mode, right? To say a community is not just coming together and having good conversations, but we wanted to take it somewhere. So me, myself, I've experienced a lot of frustrations with communities where I wanted to take that further, right? There's something that we're building here. How do we build this? How do we get to the next stage of launching something, right? And this to me is, again, where I see the DAO moving into the next level, into, not staying at a community level, but then building in some structure elements. And let me wrap up here with some ideas and clues for what these structural elements are. And that may lead sort of to other conversations in the future to say, why do you need this kind of thing, right? Have you used it? In what context, really? Are there some examples of other organizations who are starting to use these elements? and use them successfully, to build their own organization inside a DAO, right? So that leads to all kinds of other questions and follow-up things that we can dive deeper in future conversations here. But so my list of basic elements are: one, after you notice we're all coming together, there is the sense of there are different domains, right? We talked about meritocracy. So there are different fields of knowledge that seem to be segregating, that seem to be people, let's say they're pulled into these domains, right? Either because they come from a different background or they have a lot of knowledge, having worked in this area for a long time. So they're drawn into these domains, right? So that's the first sort of structural element. What comes out of this is now a more tangible thing, which we call circles, right? So suddenly a circle comes out of this to say, oh, let's group certain people, certain topics, certain domains together and say, oh, I'm drawn towards more of customer communication. I'm drawn towards innovating and building new ideas and products inside the organization. I'm drawn towards, I want to manage what these finances look like and what the future of these processes inside the organization look like. So I'm drawn towards these circles now. So suddenly there's a circle structure which I can join, right? Which I can now directly go in and say, I want to become a member of that circle. They seem to be focusing on things that I'm really passionate about finding out. Let's go there, right? And then the next level is, okay, now I'm joining the circle, but in what capacity, right? So we talked about sort of, you bring in the skills, you bring in the passion. Now you can actually combine that into what we call a role inside an organization. Again, that's a deep dive for another call to see really what a role is, what role archetypes are, what kind of templates we could create for organization to put that all together. But for now, it's just a role, right? To say, oh, I'm holding some capacity encapsulated in this role thing. I can apply for that. People actually acknowledging that I'm coming into the organization and feel there's a fit. Maybe they don't know yet, then let's just bring the person in through something else called a quest. A quest is just a small project that you can run to showcase that, yes, I can do this work. I've done it 100 times. Here's how, give me a small thing to do. And I get also rewarded at the end of the quest, right? So good to go. And the last element I wanted to bring in here is badges. Something Alexandra is working intensively, with certain types of badges called ambassador badges or affiliate badges that just acknowledge that you want to join us, you want to help us. Well, here's a badge, and here's what it means to hold that badge, and what you can do with the badge, right? So just this recognition to say, hey, there's an ant here with a badge on top with some stripes, right? We can recognize the ant, it has bigger claws, it has certain functions, inside the anthill. But it is visible to anybody, right? And what you can do with these badges is enormous. We're just scratching the surface with all of these elements to see what's really possible in this new playground that we're opening up here. Thank you. Over to you.
Yeah, and to conclude, you kind of give the overview of everything, and just for closing thought, I want to give kind of bird's eye perspective of what we discuss. I just see that organizations are evolving, and we as humans are raising level of complexity. So it's kind of now really marry this idea of community with this idea of coordinating action, right? So I really see like what we have in Hypha is kind of on the level of complexity of kind of some states, right? We have constitution, we are voting for things. So the way currently organization work, I'm seeing in the kind of nature of this book that I mentioned that is explaining that kind of in order to kind of get into man archetype, you cannot remove boy archetype. You just need to contain it. So in the same way, I see that some things from traditional organization are still there, but they are not the most important. It's like we have circles and we have coordinated action, but that's not all there is to the DAO. That's why for me, the DHO is much closer term, which is kind of decentralized human organization. It's like, yeah, we are here for each other and we have parts where we are coordinating action, but that's not all to it. So it's just the way I'm seeing all of this is kind of higher level of complexity where we are kind of containing what traditional organization doing, but there is more to it. And what more there is, I think we are discovering.
Wonderful, folks. Very good conversation. See you again next week where we continue this exploration into all of the nuances, both known and unknown, in the decentralized autonomous organization space. So catch you there. Thanks, everyone.